So it's a particular pleasure to have a chance to talk to Ken Moody, who I was reckoning we've worked together on and off for over 30 years on various aspects of computers and history. Ken, I always start with asking when and where my interviewee was born.
I was born in Harford County Hospital in March 1940. That's all right.
That's very detailed. And then I ask about families, and as far back as you like. Some people tend to go back to the Armada or something like that, but anything about that you'd like to say about your grandparents, for example, that generation, or to your parents? It's really to...
I think my grandparents, my mother's family, came from Northern Ireland. Her father was born in Ulster. He came from some way to the west of Belfast, and Eglinton was the little town where the family came from. The rumour is that they were sheep stealers. They were certainly, we believed for a long time, related to the famous John Adams, who was one of the participants in the mutiny on the Bounty. But recently a cousin of mine has rather undermined this pleasant fantasy. What has happened to the family since, I think like many families in Victorian times, there were huge numbers of siblings. My grandfather, that's my mother's father, was one of 12. He was the eldest. He was the one who was set for a career in the UK, and his many brothers were sent off to the colonies to find their own way. And so I have second cousins scattered throughout what we used to think then as the British Empire. And so that was, my grandfather was a customs officer. He moved around the country. My mother was born, I believe, let me get this right, in Weymouth, and then he moved to Cardigan, and her upbringing was in Cardigan, and then he moved back to London and back to base, and she was educated in her teens at Winchmore Hill Collegiate School for Girls, where she was a star pupil.
Well, Sarah was brought up Winchmore Hill, but anyway,
okay, very good.
We'll come back to coincidences later.
And my father's grandfather on that side, very different. Somehow more, as I understand it, that he was always interested in money. There's a rumour that the family came from, I'm sure the family did come from the Isle of Wight, but I don't know which generation back that would be. He certainly married his first cousin. It's one reason that their eldest daughter, Marjorie, was so stubborn and pig-headed.
Is Marjorie going to watch this?
Marjorie, I don't think, will reappear. I think it's worth recording that my mother was the second of 5, going one generation down, not such large families, and she was the only girl of 5. My father was the second of 5 and the only boy of 5. So there's a pleasant symmetry. They met in I suppose, in the mid-30s, probably early 30s, because they'd known one another for a while. They got married in 1934.
What did your father do?
My father worked in his father's business.
Customs?
No, the other side.
Ah, yes.
What
was it? Apart from money?
Money, he ran an accountant's firm, but fundamentally he cornered the real estate of Tottenham. And so he was a director with his father, my grandfather, of various companies called North Suburban Estates Limited, Tottenham Estates, and they were reformed by the Rackman period. I think the Rent Act of 1968 caused them to improve some of their properties.
Rackman, yes.
But certainly they were ostensibly accountants, but they ran large property firms, and my grandfather, that's my father's father, had done well enough by the mid-20s to buy what was a very large country estate in Hertfordshire.
Did you have anything to do with that estate?
Well, I grew up in Whitford, which is the village where it was, during the war. So the formative years of my life had my grandfather, who was an authority figure, living just down the road. But by then my father was dead. He died when I was only a month old.
A month old?
Yeah, he died. He had probably got some sort of congenital tendency to high cholesterol levels. He had a brain hemorrhage at the age of 38. Even my mother, who'd not worked since they got married in 1934, because that was the custom of the time, and so she found herself, she was a qualified lawyer, she had an LLB from King's College London, and so she was, in technical terms, quite able to earn her own living, but of course she couldn't qualify as a solicitor because she was unable to pay to take the articles that would have been necessary. So she she started in 1940 when my father died, and ended when she retired, which was in about, I suppose, 1968, working for Longmore's in Harford. Said I was born in Harford. We've always been in that part of the world until I went to Cambridge, actually. So the whole of my early life was in and around Harford.
Tell me something about your mother's character that, in any way that might have affected your future career. Was she interested in mathematics, or? She
was, I think, extremely clever. She was literary and into language rather than on the science side, but she was a good mathematician. It's worth, I think this will come out, her elder brother, Wilfred, I said she was one of 5. Wilfred was a scientist. He did the statistical estimation for the design of the first traffic lights installed in the UK, which were in Piccadilly Circus in, I think, the 20s. His son, Frank Adams, was one of the world's great mathematicians.
Oh, yes.
And so, certainly, the maths genes were in the family, and I'm sure my mother had them, but she was an actress, an amateur actress and a good one. She had huge tracts of English literature in her mind. When she got Alzheimer's, give or take, much later in life, and was in a nursing home, she reacted to the French nursing staff by reciting the poems of Baudelaire with them to their surprise and admiration, as she couldn't really tell the time of day by that stage.
That's sweet. So you obviously liked her.
She was terrific. She was all my life, really, because I never knew my father to the strong extent that I don't remember him at all. What I do remember is his name, Ken. I was born and registered as John Kenneth, John, my customs officer, maternal grandfather, Kenneth after my father, but the second name, Montague, after my successful money-making grandfather, Moody. And when my father died after a month, I was immediately renamed as Ken, and I've been Ken ever since. And I try and keep cool most of the time, but I've just received a new credit card from my bank in the name of Dr John Moody, and I have cut it up and told them what to do with it. And they will reissue it. They were quite affable about it.
Interesting. So let's move. You didn't have any siblings?
No siblings. No, I was the first, and for obvious reasons, the only one.
Tell me about your first school. Was that in Hertford or your primary school?
We actually lived in Broxbourne, which is about 5 miles from Hertford, and I went to the local kindergarten, Miss Lawson's, which was on the edge of the little stream that flows through Broxbourne and into the River Lee, the Spittle Brook, and Miss Lawson's school was overlooked in a big house in St Catherine's Road, and actually Osborne Road, coming to think of it, and that was where I was sent from aged 5 till 8, and I was taught parsing. I could parse an English sentence. I knew my tables up to probably 17 times because I was good at that sort of thing. I had the beginnings of French, and I look today at what is happening, and I was extremely privileged.
Were you already, I was interviewing Peter Swinnerton Dyer, and he reminisced. I said, when did maths start with you? And he said, well, my mother had to keep me quiet in the bath at the age of 2 by setting me mathematical problems. Were you even then aware in any way that maths was something that interested you?
I wasn't aware of it to the same extent, perhaps, but my mother certainly was, because when I was perhaps 2.5 or 3, I don't want to compete with Peter Swinnerton Dyer, I was being a nuisance by interfering in the grown-ups' conversation, and she said to this very, very young child, Kenneth, go away and work out how many window panes there are in that window. And apparently I returned alarmingly quickly and said, I think there are 35. So I must have known either my 5 times table or my 7 times table at that stage.
That's lovely. And sometimes some people find even their primary school there is a teacher who sparked their interest.
I think it has to be Mrs. Pedley with the parsing of the English language and the sense. As a mathematician, I liked rules. I liked syntax. I liked the sense that what appeared to be unregulated could in fact be disciplined. And, well, she's the name that I remember, and that is the subject that I count as most important in my formative years. So probably that would be Mrs. Pedley.
And then at 8?
At 8, I went off to prep school. Now, my mother was, I think, quite mixed about private education. At one level it was expensive, but she needed to work. She needed me off her hands. My cousin, I've referred to him indirectly, but Brown Scott, went to a prep school in Chorley Wood on the other side of Hertfordshire. My mother was very close to Brown's mother, Moira Scott. They recommended the school, which, as prep schools go, was cheap. Moira was nearby, and so I went to Beaumont House in Heronsgate, which was a curious Chartist relic village settlement between Rickmansworth and Chorley Wood. And there were no metalled roads. This was in the late 40s, early 50s, so perhaps that sounds less remarkable, but it was a statement of the agricultural, the natural, back to nature movement. And there were some quite grand houses, and Beaumont House, which was where the school was right down the end of one of the lanes through Heronsgate, on the edge of, gosh, what was the name? The Lady Walk. There was the rumour of a headless lady who walked this beechwood in the Chilterns every evening. We never saw her, and I'm told that people tried.
And what was it like as a school? Was it okay?
The headmaster taught the senior classes mathematics. He was a mathematical amateur enthusiast rather than a professional mathematician. He was a terrific teacher.
What was his name?
Peter Vesey. And he was clearly an important person in my life. I think he was a good guy. Comment on the British colonial service of that period, or perhaps the generation before. When he was young, he thought he should go and see the world and improve life in the colonies, and because he was interested in teaching, he volunteered as an inspector of schools, and he was asked where he would like to go, and he said East Africa, and so he spent 5 years in Nigeria inspecting the schools.
Geography was not the strong point of those people.
I think it was more convenient at the time to appoint someone to. It was easy to get people to go to East Africa.
But he taught you towards the end of your time there, presumably.
And I was taught by a collection. There was another charismatic teacher of Latin called Vernon Birds, who had fought through the First War through the trenches and bore the psychological scars, you might say, of that experience. But he had a fantastic enthusiasm for the classics, and I don't just mean teaching boys Latin, but the whole of the culture, the literature, the tradition, the contribution to knowledge. And that was very exciting, because you got someone who was a bit crazy, but who really cared and who could put it across. So he was an important figure.
Sounds as if on the whole it was exciting and stimulating and not too dreary experience.
It was, I think, a pretty good school. I've no basis for comparison. I think it was quite successful for me.
You weren't bullied or...
I wasn't bullied.
Particularly lonely?
I wasn't particularly lonely. I was by then extremely good at sums. And I'm not sure if you bully people who are good at sums, but they're a bit odd. They are seen as a bit odd. And
you were good at games, I imagine.
I was good at games that didn't matter. I was quite good at cricket. I was ostensibly a fast bowler at that stage. What I was happiest with was hitting small balls that moved. So cricket I enjoyed batting, though I wasn't necessarily so good at it. I liked tennis. Broxbourne, where I'd grown up, had what was then and still is a very good tennis club. And I'm worried that we're not making sufficient progress.
No, this is very interesting. And then that led later into fives and squash, which you were very good at.
Not fives, but squash.
Squash.
Squash you didn't have available at a prep school, of course.
Yeah.
But tennis helped. And I think the difference between squash and tennis was that when I was playing tennis, at that age of sort of 10, 11, 12, 13, I didn't realise that I was actually playing squash on the tennis court, because I didn't know that squash existed. But once I met a squash court, I understood, and I continued to play squash on the tennis court through the summer, and well enough to play for the county, and that was so quite good.
Well, let's then move on to the next school. Why were you sent to an Imperial Services College, which is presumably where you were, Haileybury?
Haileybury was nearly amalgamated with the Imperial Service College. I'm sure you understand that the East India College Arms, which is the pub in Harford Heath, which is adjacent to the school, refers to the old East India Company's College, which was before the founding of the school, which was in the mid-1850s. So the buildings were there and they reflected the colonial tradition. But of course, when I went to Haileybury, which was in 1953, Peter Vesey had been at Haileybury. Equally important, it was just down the road from Broxbourne, indeed midway between Broxbourne and Harford, where my mother worked. My mother's boss, John Longmore, was on the governors of Haileybury, and he was able to get additional bursaries and really make being sent to Haileybury probably no more expensive than to a relatively cheap prep school. Without that connection, I don't think, well, I'm sure my mother would not have been able to afford to send me away. And in some ways it didn't suit me, but they let me play squash, they let me play tennis. My housemaster is recorded as saying, provided he's got a small ball that he can hit. And there was a house ping pong table, so I was house ping pong champion. And so I was completely content.
He's all right.
Sorry?
What was the end of that remark of your housemaster? Provided he's got a small ball,
he's happy.
He's happy.
He's happy. And he didn't add wasting his time, which could be spent more profitably on mathematics, though he may have felt it.
Did you, I mean, I can't resist our personal connection. My uncle was housemaster of Melville, I think it was, called Richard Rhodes James. Did you come across him at all?
I think he said, various people have said things to me that I found unanswerable, but he very definitely ranks as, I think, number one. He was had a long career in Burma. He was with the Chindits in Burma. He was therefore associated with the CCF, the cadet force, and he was an officer in charge of C Company. And C Company's order for the day, on one occasion, included the encouraging footnote, Lance Corporals Moody and Tingey will act in reserve. So I'd spoke with Pete Tingey about this before the briefing session at the start of field day, and we hovered around near the back, and no one said anything about Lance Corporals Tingey and Moody. So we returned to the house, where we were discovered by the same housemaster playing snooker in the middle of the morning. We were told to report to the CCF at lunch, and it was RJ who interviewed us. And we explained this story, which sounded to me perfectly rational. And I realised it was a bit lame when, after he'd heard it, he said, "I see, so you just sloped off."
How sweet.
Well, actually, we got out of it without any reprimand. I think for the lucky coincidence that the two Lance Corporals who had been selected to act in reserve were both from the same house, and our housemaster felt sufficiently incensed and disadvantaged by this that he took our side.
Well, I've talked to him obviously about you, and you, apparently the legend of your mathematical prowess lived on after you in the school. He said, you were the best mathematician Haileybury had had for some years, and so on and so on. They were very proud of you. Was it developing on your side as well? I mean, did you already...
I was a good mathematician in the sense that I could do all the questions and in quick time, and it was only when I reached S level that I had any real difficulties. I was very lucky in that at the time that I moved from the fifth form to enter A level in what was called at Haileybury the upper fifth, a new mathematics teacher, Stuart Parsonson, was appointed. Frank Newbold, who was the then took over as head of maths, was a very good teacher, but he was quite traditional. Stuart took one look at Haileybury's policy, which was that you took 2 years over A level and an additional year in the sixth, or now the upper sixth, if you wanted to do S levels, said, in mathematics that's completely ridiculous. We've got quite a number of capable people, of whom I was one. They can do S level in 2 years. So we did S level in 2 years, and I was ready to take the entrance examination, which still existed, to Cambridge at the start, so in the December of my third year in the sixth. That would seem to me a completely normal timetable for an able mathematician, but it was only the chance of Stuart's arrival that made that possible. Yeah, and I mean, going back to the idea, there were a lot of good mathematicians around. I was probably the best in my year, but there were other good mathematicians in the school.
Were there other subjects which you were finding, were there other science or art subjects which you particularly enjoyed as well?
Well, I mentioned Vernon Bird's at my prep school,
Yes.
and I shocked the classical fifth at O level by coming top in the entire school in Latin, because this was meant to be the classical fifth, and there were specialist classicists who did Greek, and I felt, I think, reasonably confident that I could have done Latin A level as well as maths and physics, and asked the school whether this would be possible. And there was a lot of toing and froing, and I was then told that if I really wished to change to classics, since I appeared to be able, I could probably learn Greek from scratch, which completely missed the point. So at that point, I gave Latin up until it became necessary to polish it a bit for the entrance exam to Cambridge, and I did find it very easy. Again, perhaps going back to Mrs. Pedley at kindergarten, because there were formal rules, and the syntax would conform to those rules. I loved elegiac couplets, because once again...
Do you like Pope? Well, that's poetry. Alexander Pope.
Yes, I mean, yes. I think there's a similar formality, but semantic content with it. I was more interested in the syntax, I think, than the semantics.
Were there any other teachers in the school who particularly influenced you?
Stuart Parsonson would be number one.
Yeah.
I think no one on the classics side. There was a very good... English changed its nature after you'd done O-level, because everyone took English, but it became a subject for relaxation in the mathematical sixth form. And a teacher called Jack Thomas would give us interesting books to read and make us talk about them, and that was an important thing. No, there are lots of teachers. Bertie Bradstock teaching us French for O-level. He was a character, and actually lived down the road in Broxton.
Sounds again as if it was a mostly positive and pleasant enough experience.
I was happy at school. I wouldn't say the happiest days of my life in any nostalgic sense, but I think you take things as you find them. They let me play games.
What about other hobbies? You were a bird watcher at that stage?
I was a bird watcher from the age of 3, and I might perhaps should have mentioned that, because in connection with living in Whitford through the war, my mother had worked before she was married in the Cabinet Office. She was secretary, PA, to Hubert Henderson, who was part of the Keynes think tank. Indeed, he was the chairman of that group. And Hubert was sufficiently worried at her brain going to waste after she got married that he set up a guy called Hope Bagnall, who had married his sister. Hope was a visionary architect. He was a wonderful mixture of the practical and the abstract. He did, among other things, the acoustic design for the Royal Festival Hall. So he was highly intelligent, very laid back, but he was a bird watcher. And he would come over and really see my mother. He had a car which he managed to get petrol for somehow in the war, and he would turn up from time to time, and we would go down to the River Ash and watch birds. And I remember seeing my first kingfisher there with him. And so I've always been a bird watcher. I don't have a life list. I'm not a twitcher, I would claim. I like seeing the birds of the region, wherever they belong. I'm never off duty. I have lightweight binoculars which I can carry with me in any context in which I can go. So, and that was true at my prep school, which was a good environment for watching birds. It was true at Haileybury. I remember red-backed shrikes on the common. Harford Heath had red-backed shrikes. There were some very close to our house. And I've never been off duty as a bird watcher since I started at the age of 3, I suppose. So that was a hobby. On Friday afternoons, instead of running around the school or playing squash or fives, there was an option that you could do what were called public works. And I tried building, and we were erecting a pretty inadequate wall in a harmless corner of the gardens. And that was quite fun. But later I became a printer, and this was with a character called E.J. Miller, who was known as Herr Muller because he had a slightly strange accent and was rumoured to have commanded a German U-boat during the war. But he ran a quite sizable printing press, and once I'd started printing, I remained printing for the rest of my time in Hungary. So that was a serious hobby.
And since he always comes up at some stage or other, what about God? I mean, the teenage is a period when one sometimes has God.
If you go to a well-organised colonial service school, thoughts about God are subsumed by the strict timetable for confirmation, which is really a ritual process, and one moves from being a christened member of the church to being a confirmed member of the church, without too much thought going into the process. My mother, I think we went to church every Sunday. I think she became, not exactly doubts, but she became more concerned with the substance as well as the ritual later in life. I could always, I think, take or leave the ideas. It was really when I went to university that I started thinking about these things rather more seriously. Taking communion is something that one did while at school and continued to do, at least at the beginning through the holidays, but rather rapidly by the time I had left school, I was no longer a communicating member of the community. And I think doubts isn't the right word, because you have to have something to doubt. So I don't think it was like that.
But you say at university you began to think about it again.
I began to think about it to the extent that I'm definitely not an atheist. I get strong theological moments, normally things like birds, ducks on a bright summer's day give me strong theological moments because, Darwinism is all very well, but if it's an accident, it's a very happy accident.
So a sense of wonder Einstein, when asked about his faith, it was more to do with a sense of some mystery or wonder which he couldn't pin down. It wasn't any particular God in the sky, but something
I've described myself when pressed as a vague pantheist, and that's about as far as I will go. Other ostensibly religious, God-looking moments, I went to Chiang Mai. I could be a Buddhist more easily than some things, but I don't think anyone. That's the nice thing. No one's going to make me be a Buddhist.
No, they won't. That's why, paradoxically, one might become one.
That's the sort of feeling. But I went to there's a monastery above the summer palace, which you train your mind for by ascending up some large number of steps, but in the hundreds. And it's a very silent, peaceful, static environment, and I found it very sympathetic.
Well, let's go on to university. Did you just try for Cambridge or other universities as well?
I just tried for Cambridge because there was this tradition in the school that it took 3 years from O-level, in other words from the start of your A-level, to gain university entrance. I was told that in the first year after taking my A-levels and of course my S-levels, I should do the Cambridge entrance. Stuart Parsonson had been supervised while in Cambridge by Norman Routledge, which he had regarded as a positive experience, and it was therefore decided that I should apply to King's College, where Norman was Director of Studies. So I duly did the entrance examination. I didn't find all the papers easy, but I do remember that in the mechanics, I looked at the questions and they all looked possible, and I tossed a mental coin and decided to start at question 10, and I had done 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and had nearly finished 1 by the time the bell went. That was my most successful paper by quite a way, though. But it was still enough to get a major scholarship to King's. So I then spent the rest of that year, perhaps I should have gone away, but I was still relatively young. I mean, I was under 18 at that stage. And Stuart Parsonson taught me the first year syllabus for the maths tripos, so that when I arrived, as people did at that stage, I went straight into prelim to part 2 mathematics, and so missed part 1 completely.
Gosh. So you arrived at King's, what year was this?
This was 1958. And
tell me about some of the 58. Was Noel Annan Provost?
Was Provost. Gosh, we all think back to Noel Annan, and there were all sorts of good things going for Noel, but he was to students a little on the pompous side, and he was full of himself. And somehow I think the things that made it easy to forgive these apparent weaknesses, and which his colleagues could adjust to, the students found really very difficult. There was, indeed, I was going to say a story, but it wasn't a story. I'm telling it, but it was true. He had people round to see him, I think it was every Sunday evening in the Provost's Lodge, who were always welcome to go around. If any student would like to come around to talk, and this notice had been amended, if any student would like to come around to listen. And so, very positive in lots of ways. He interacted, he wished to interact, he was quite good at it. I think the most decisive thing for me in going up to King's in October 1958 was the dichotomy between half of the entrants who had already done national service and the other half who had not. I was the third quarter of the year to have missed out on national service. The 2 previous ones had registered but had not been called up. I was the first quarter that had not been registered. So one moved into a suddenly independent near adult society in which half of those participating were straight from school. The other half had had 2 years of national service. And the social shock that this led to, it was a tremendous learning experience. I think that was the most interesting thing, and also I don't know whether I think of myself as shy, but I found going up to Cambridge quite a frightening experience, and it was very good because before coming out of my room and meeting anyone, I read the whole of War and Peace. And it was time well spent. I then found the ping pong table and met people and made friends and started playing ping pong and squash and such like. But I was in hiding. It must have been about a week.
King's always prides itself having a reputation for a certain closeness between the fellows and the undergraduates, more than a number of colleges in the era of, Keynes and Foster and so on. And it still talks about this sometimes. It should have been more evident at this period, and your story of Noel suggests that even at the top it was encouraged. But did you sense this? Because now people lament the fact that with numbers and time and pressures this has declined hugely.
I think I should say a few words about Norman Routledge. Norman Routledge was the Director of Studies in King's. He was the reason that I went to King's. He was a charismatic supervisor. He is a very capable mathematician. He was an assistant lecturer in the Department of Pure Mathematics. I don't think he got on with his his research. Certainly he wasn't confirmed to the retiring age. And he left actually after a year. And I think he was one of the last, maybe, period of academics who lost their chance of an academic career through too much interaction with the young. I mean, Norman he was one of the founders of the King's College Loan Record Library, which was a wonderful resource for the students of that period. Indeed, I learnt to understand and enjoy classical music, partly from the availability of records that one could simply take out for a very small fee, and partly because Norman, with Philip Radcliffe, who was an elderly music fellow.
Even elderly then.
He was elderly when I was but a child. And they organised weekly meetings called Chats About Recorded Music. And Ian Forster would participate as well. I remember him listening to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and then recalling what he had written in Heart's End on that subject. So it was a good environment for someone with a limited military public school background, because there were all sorts of new doors to be opened. Too many.
Too many. What about the moving on from music to drama? I mean, Daily Rylands must have been fairly active still at that time.
There was a limited number of hours in the week, and I came to appreciate Daddy much later when I was a fellow, and whenever he was talking or reading, then I would be out there and listening. I didn't know him when I was a student at all. Lots of my friends did, because the Marlowe Society, this was in the period that they were making lots of decisive recordings, actually.
Were there any of your undergraduate friends as an undergraduate who were particularly important to you and have remained friends?
Oh, there's quite a few. Alan Robiette and I ended up sharing, I was going to say a house, but a slice of a house, when we both became research students. We both played cricket. Mike Stevens was another mathematician. He went off to Canada, but he was a dynamic pianist who, and also he lived life to the full, and he was, as I say, he didn't do prelim to part 2 in his first year, so although we were the same year, we weren't doing the same subject. Thinking of other people who were important, John Dunn, I knew, who...
Was he at the same time?
He was a year later, but I got to know John quite early on. Yes, I mean, trying to think, there's no one of my year that I think has remained. Alan Robiette is the one that I'm in closest touch with.
Were there any mathematicians outside King's whose lectures or work was already beginning to impress you and excite you?
I think the thing that made most difference to me mathematically was when Norman Routledge was not confirmed in his university job, and John Williamson, who was at Christ's at that stage and had recently been appointed in the pure maths department, moved to King's to become Director of Studies, because he was a very different character from Norman. By then John already had 3 children. He lived in the large house which later the Polacks took over from him in Hills Road. I got to know the family well. I also liked I'm not sure whether I liked the mathematics because I liked John, but I found his mathematics, which was functional analysis, was the sort of thing that actually I found it relatively easy by comparison with Philip Hall, who was a Fellow of King's. I attended Philip's Part 3 lectures, but I did not find the material easy. I found all of the analysis material easy, and I was obviously cut out to be an analyst rather than an algebraist. I don't know what that says about my mathematics. Maybe I like it slightly more clearly grounded. I'm not sure.
And was the great tradition of mathematics at Trinity still going at all? I mean,
very much so, yes.
The Hardy legacy. Hardy wasn't around, was he?
Hardy wasn't around, but Trinity still had...
and Swinnerton Dower was there.
Swinnerton Dower was there. Probably half the people who lectured to me, I'm exaggerating, were at Trinity. But my cousin Frank Adams, whom I mentioned before, came back and became a research fellow. And then he moved to Trinity Hall, actually. I'm not sure of Frank's chronology. But yes, so I wasn't particularly influenced by Trinity. And maths, there was a lot of it, and one went to the lectures, and supervisions were arranged within the college, and one had to do the exercises set for supervisions, and it was a lot of work. And I certainly, there were college mathematical societies, and I would go to talks in the evenings if I was interested in the subject, but there was no sense in which I was attached to a particular college group. I would go to the subjects that took my fancy.
So at the end of your undergraduate, this is 3 years, or was it 4 years?
3 years. 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah.
Didn't some people later do 4 years in mathematics? I mean, Charles seemed to
remember that I started doing part 2.
Oh, that's right.
So what happened was I got the 4th year, but I took it in my 3rd year.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, this is something that I was talking about only recently with the demise of the diploma in computer science. It's the last year the department has run the diploma, and I was the coordinator of the course for a very long time, and I was able to recall the fact that although I never took the diploma, I had been accepted for it in 1961 for the year 1961 to 62. But that was circumvented because I did sufficiently well in part 3, rather to my surprise and maybe against my better judgment. And they said, many are called but few are chosen. You, sir, should do research in mathematics and we have money for you. And this sounded very attractive, so I agreed to their suggestion. And so the place on the diploma in computer science went begging, and I spent 3 years, then a 4th year, then most of a 5th year, I'm afraid, doing a PhD in mathematics and playing a lot of squash and tennis, and then went off to work for IBM.
Who was your supervisor for PhD?
A lady called Margaret Grimshaw, whose main claim to fame was a reported romance with the German mathematician Hamburger, which certainly led...
Michael? No, that's a poet, isn't it?
I don't know.
Yeah.
But Hamburger and Grimshaw was the textbook of the period, and this was apparently the intellectual offspring of this relationship. Anyway, Margaret Grimshaw was a fellow of Newman and an exceptionally nice lady, but she did very little to drive my mathematical research. I looked to John Williamson, I was working in his general area. He had too many PhD students of his own, and so although I had a problem, I attacked it rather fitfully. I did, on the other hand, do enormous amounts of undergraduate supervision, certainly up to 15 hours a week at one time. Actually irresponsible.
Why was that? Was it?
It's because I think John needed supervisors. I did it rather well. He took the view quite rightly that I was either supervising or playing squash. On the whole, a mixture of the two was better than entirely squash. I mean, I did advance.
Not for money, I mean, you were all right there.
I was all right for money. I had a grant. Grants in those days were very good. And by then, my grandfather had died, and I took the decision that the money that he left me two things about it. One, I didn't get it till about 5 years later, because realising half of Tottenham takes a while, which is what you need to do if you're winding up an estate which owns half of Tottenham.
Yeah.
I should say that I was one of a very large number of legatees, so this was not all coming to me by any means. So I didn't need money. On the other hand, I think I enjoyed supervising. As I say, I was a popular supervisor. The results improved steadily, and certainly the students I supervised did as well as any of the others. So
And that's why, but that's why it took you so long, perhaps.
it probably contributed. Or I think it's probably fairer to say that I got it done because I kept my mathematics up and running, and I didn't just play squash.
Let's just move on to IBM, and then there might be a break, but why did you go to IBM?
I went to IBM because I completed a maths PhD. I looked for things that I might do with it. I'd not published anything. Had I? No, I don't think I published anything at that stage. And I did not have an academic drive. I was interested in the problems that I worked on, but I wasn't compelled to solve them. And I thought that if I was going to continue in mathematics, there was no future for me, because I was not going to do the necessary research. And so I looked for other things that might be interesting. I went to the Defence Operational Analysis Establishment, who play war games. I met a very nice guy called Dr Hugh Simon, who had an algebra PhD from Oxford, who was a very senior academic computer scientist at IBM Hersley. And I found both of these environments offered interesting, grounded problems that I was convinced would engage my interest in a way that research in mathematics had never done. Oddly enough, King's came to the rescue and made the decision for me, because I went to a dinner, and I'm not quite clear why, as a long outstayed welcome PhD student, I should have been attending the King's dinner, but I sat next to Philip Noel Baker, and he said, "And tell me, if you worked for the DOAE, what would be the productive element? Surely, if any of the things that you were investigating were used, were exploited, would you be happy with that thought?" And so I went to IBM, because the nature of what is productive about war games, and having been put like that, I would take the same decision again. I joined IBM in February 1967. IBM had very high expectations of the amount of time that their staff would put in, but they were a wonderfully paternalistic employer. They looked at my background and decided that, one, I should be recruited to IBM government branch. Essentially, this was large scientific machines where my background would enable me to talk to customers. That, I think, was a good decision. And they sent me almost instantly to the Rutherford Laboratory on the Chiltern side, next to the Chiltern Atlas Lab and AERE Hull. And there I made lots of good friends. There was a story that IBM at that period had to wear white shirts and suits every day. It's not quite as simple as that. One's manager would always telephone if he was going to come down, and he would always find a neatly polished, bright and shining set of IBM employees. But on other days, we were encouraged to look like the natives and dress like the natives. And I think this worked very well.
How long were you there?
I was there for nearly 2 years. And Well, not entirely at Rutherford. I moved to Harwell, and by the middle of 1968 I was acting as a countessee at Harwell, working extremely long hours, doing very interesting work. I'd learned a great deal about computing, but the more I learned, the more I was aware that you only see the IBM pitch, and there are other, and sometimes you knew that you wouldn't have designed it like that. Sometimes you even had a glimmer of how you might have designed it. So I was aware of this, and having met Hugh Ap Simon, I knew that there was a subject, computer science, evolving out over beyond my horizon, and that was a bit unsatisfactory actually. At the time I had an Australian girlfriend, Anne Howie, and she was still completing a PhD in zoology in Cambridge, so I did get back to Cambridge from time to time, and that made me make contact with people who knew what was going on in the computer lab. And so I knew there was another side to computing that I had no exposure to or experience of.
When was it you first, I mean, you mentioned that you were down for the diploma in 61, so even as an undergraduate, did you do any computing?
I'd never done any, but I was thinking about getting a job, having a career, and I was quite serious when I suggested that the maths department wooed me. I mean, it was not a big effort, but they said, hey, you did really well, here's money. But my previous thought had been probably more sensible. That was to change to computing there.
You were in the college, perhaps this was 10 or 15 years later, of Alan Turing. Was his shadow or his memory still alive in King's at that time?
Not at all. I don't think, I mean, probably among the fellowship, people like A.E. Ingham, who was a senior King's mathematician. I didn't mention him earlier, but he was a quiet, dignified, capable senior supervisor, and I learned a lot of pure mathematics from him. So
he would remember him. But
he would have remembered, but there was no general discussion of Alan Turing. I think it was a hard subject to discuss, actually.
Why? Because of his ending?
Because of his ending. And I think there was also Maurice Wilkes in Cambridge at the time. And the Cambridge initiative to build computers was very much in competition with Manchester, where Turing had been, and Turing was also at the NPL, the National Physical Laboratory, and these were the other locations. I think in King's, Turing was remembered. Wilkes didn't talk much about Turing. Wilkes got on with the job and built computers, so slightly different.
I mean, when did you first come across Wilkes? You didn't come across him as an undergraduate?
I didn't come across him as an undergraduate. I didn't come across him in 1961 when I went to find out about the diploma. Eric Much, who was then the deputy director of the, as it was called, mathematical laboratory, was responsible for organising admission to the diploma, and he's the person that I spoke with about the course. No, I didn't know of Wilkes's existence until 1968. I said I was at Harwell and becoming progressively aware that things were done differently elsewhere. And I think John Williamson had been talking with Roger Needham, probably as the deputy to Wilkes, and possibly with Wilkes as well, about this bloke who was working for IBM, who might perhaps be better suited to an academic career in computing. And so they certainly probably knew of my existence. And what happened next was that John Williamson said, well, if you really wanted to, it's possible that there'd be a job at the computer lab for you, and you could take over from me because I've got a chair at York and do the directing of studies in maths in King's as well. Another disastrous career move. One should not contemplate doing these things simultaneously, with the benefit of hindsight, understanding what I do now about academic careers. Obviously not what one should be doing, but I was attracted to both, and it seemed a reasonable, not compromise, but combination. And I saw no reason why the University Mathematical Laboratory would want me. And I think the same is true of them, because they said, oh, well, if he's going to come, he'll need references. And I thought, what can I do for references? And the obvious thing to do was my senior advisor in IBM, or maybe one of the managers. But I didn't want to tell them I was thinking of up and leaving them, because my career was going quite well, actually. And there's nothing, and I liked IBM, and I still like IBM. So I thought, who else might be? And the customer came to mind. There are all these scientists who wore normal clothes that I would talk about computing problems really all day. And I picked the one I knew best, and had actually solved quite a tricky problem for him, and had made his Hoff-Powell device a lot more productive than it had ever been before. And explained to him what was going on, and he said, oh, where's the reference for? And I said, well, it's the computer lab at Cambridge. And he said, oh, I think I could do that. I knew nothing about John's background. This is John Barron, the physicist in question. But it seemed to me a sort of half smile crossed his face. What he didn't say was, oh, and by the way, I shared a flat with Roger Needham when we were graduate students in Cambridge together. So not only did he write me a good reference, but it hit the right spot. So I was welcomed with open arms, actually. And IBM, were, bless their cotton socks, were sorry to see me go. And I spent 3 years on academic leave of absence from IBM, having gone back to Cambridge on what might not have been a full-time career decision. And I think that made it slightly easier. It cost IBM nothing, because it made it more likely that if things didn't work out, I'd come back to them, which they were keen on.